My name is Debbie Waddell, alias Drama Mama. That's the name I earned, like a Native American might have earned their name. But that's another story. As it is, whether it's a storytelling festival or otherwise, story, I'm not sure it ever has a beginning. There's always another story. Well, my story started out in Odessa, Texas, where a very fine teacher by the name of Laura had met the folk tellers, and she brought them to our city. When I heard the folk tellers, I knew I'd come home. My background had been theater, but storytelling was my heart, and they showed me that. Not long after, Laura wrote Finley Stewart because he knew how to establish a guild and become a nonprofit organization. So I met Finley through Laura in all this communication while we tried to set up a guild. In the meantime, I was busy trying to do stories at my school as well. Well, then Laura says, oh, there's a festival coming. So we got up here. I believe it was the third year. I've been here ever since, unless emergencies occurred. My daughter was 2, so I left her with a friend. And we came, and I met that Finley Stewart. If there'd ever been a person that was more like an elf, not in the sense of what today might say an elf is, but in the sense of what my mother would have said, an elf. One that went around and did so many things, and yet you couldn't find them, but they were there. There was Finley. There was Finley's laughter. There was Finley's wonderful things that he created. I grant you, maybe they went overboard sometimes, but don't we all? Well, Finley was the foundation that laid our guild. And on top of that, it was every year here at the festival, until my daughter was 5. So I brought my daughter with me. And we began that tradition of blankets on the front row, looking at the stage. And there was my little 5-year-old. And there was Chris, Elizabeth Ellis's grandson. And there were the children of the signers. And they all grew up year after year, listening to stories. Then my mother moved to Texas after my dad passed. Now that's another story with my mother. But the day that I must tell, from 2 beautiful ladies, Charlotte was on stage telling the story of when the person came through town and did a theatrical production with the people of the community. As Charlotte was telling it in her wonderful, activated way, my mother was almost out of her seat, and she couldn't walk very well at the time, ready to explain to her exactly how she did the job of traveling place to place and putting on those shows. The electricity and the spark between those 2 ladies was something that showed you story is in no time and every time. Story, they were there then, they were there now, and it always is. So when I said goodbye to Charlotte in later years, when I said goodbye to my mother, I've learned to think of all of that story as being in between time, where it always is, it always was, it always becomes. And that's the path I'm on, and I pray I will never forget those beginnings. And this festival helped nurture the whole thing until 3 generations of Waddell women, my 5-year-old up to my 28-year-old, and my mother, who must be controlling heaven by now. We passed through the walls of storytelling, and in between time, Finley's there, Charlotte's there, my mom's there, we're here, just to remember their hope and story doesn't evaporate. It grows.
My name is Shelley Newber Tucker, and I've been telling stories for a long time. I can't remember which conference this was, but there was one in Fort Worth, Texas many years ago. At the time, I lived in Southlake, not very far from the airport. And my friend Finley Stewart called me as I was preparing to go to this conference. My husband was out of town. I had a babysitter for the night. This was going to be grand. The phone rang. It was Finley, and he said, "Shelley, Shelley, Shelley." And whenever he talked to me like that, I knew he wanted something, so I said, "What is it?" He said, "Well, there's a couple that flew into the airport, and you don't live far from the airport. We don't have anybody to go get them. Would you pick them up and bring them over here?" I said, "Okay, where do I get them?" And he told me the gate, and he told me their name is Mr. and Mrs. Pieper. And what you should do is just go into the gate and carry a sign that says storytelling. They'll find you. I said, okay. I called the babysitter and asked her to come early. And I finished getting ready for the evening. Now, this was a night out for me, and I was going to get gussied up. I had on a sequined blouse, black velvet pants, high heel shoes, eyelashes, and big hair. My babysitter came, and we slapped macaroni and cheese down for the kids. And while we were doing that, I made a storytelling sign, and I never do anything in a small way. It was an enormous sign with glitter, storytelling. And I made my way to the airport. I found the gate with no problem, grabbed that storytelling sign off the back seat, and waltzed right into the terminal, promenading around, carrying the storytelling sign and smiling at people, wondering who was Mr. and Mrs. Pieper. A very well-dressed, very handsome man in a business suit. He walked up to me and he looked at my sign. He said, "Storytelling, huh? How much do you charge for a bedtime story?" People, I threw that sign on the ground and stomped it, and I turned to him and I said, "Mister, I am a member of one of the world's oldest professions, but that's not the one." I went to the phone, the little red phone, and I called the airport and I said, "Can you please page somebody for me?" And they said, "Very well, who?" And I said, "Mr. and Mrs. Pieper." And they said, "Mr. and Mrs. Pieper. Well, what's the first name?" I said, "I don't know." They said, "Mr. and Mrs. Pieper." I said, "Yeah, that's all I've got." And I explained my situation. And at last, they came over the loudspeaker. "Well, Mr. and Mrs. Pieper, please come to gate such and such." Nobody ever showed up. This was before the day of cell phones, so I finally found a payphone, and I called Finley over in the Fort Worth at the hotel. And I said, "Finley, they never showed up." And he said, "Oh, they took a cab because they'd been waiting so long." Well, I went over to the hotel. Later that night, I met Mr. and Mrs. Pieper, a wonderful couple. And I told them the tale of my experience at the airport. Mr. Pieper looked at me and he smiled and he said, "Well, at least you know that if the storytelling doesn't work, you have something to fall back on." And thank God, the storytelling worked out.
I'm Rosanna Herndon. I'm a storyteller and have been for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been a performer all my life, so storytelling is just a different kind of performance. I've been a part of this organization since the very beginning. I was a distant member of the Texas Storytellers Guild, which preceded this organization, and was a little Denton group that started before we had this association. And then the Texas Storytelling Festival came along, and it preceded the association. So after the first festival was ending, we organized the Tejas Storytelling Association, which was meant to be a Texas and Southwestern organization for storytellers. I was a feature teller at the first festival here in Denton, around the corner in the Visual Arts Center. And it wasn't very big, and it only lasted one long day, but it was an exciting beginning. And a few of us are still around who were there for that first meeting and that first event. My longtime friend, Dr. Ted Colson, taught at North Texas for many years. And Ted and I were veterans of festivals in the oral performance of literature. And we taught the oral performance of literature in universities. We had a festival in Texas, every month, at least during the school year. And so our students all knew each other and got acquainted, and we knew each other's students. And one year, when Ted arrived at a festival, he brought with him a little redheaded kid who was about 18 years old. And his name was Finley Stewart. He was excited to be at that festival, and my students discovered very quickly that he was multi-talented. He was an artist, he was a good performer, and he was a funny, enthusiastic guy. They kept looking at him, and one of my students said, "You know, I think he's a leprechaun." And the label stuck. We soon discovered that he was also a visionary, because after I had been doing some research in family narrative and oral communication, I kept bugging Ted Colson about the fact that there was a little storytelling movement starting over in Tennessee. And Jimmy Neal Smith had decided that for his little town, that he was the journalism teacher in the high school and then the mayor of, he wanted to bring visitors to that little town. He'd organized what now is the National Storytelling Festival. And then they began to have a summer conference. We called it a Congress then, and it was out at Washington College, just out of Jonesboro. I had been going up in the summers, and I kept saying, "Ted, this is part of our teaching field. You really have to get involved." And so one summer, he appeared up there with a young man who was a graduate student, and his name was James Howard. And they were excited about storytelling. And when we came back and school began to start again in the fall, that was 1985 when Ted and James first came to Jonesboro. Finley Stewart heard about it, and he said, "I will have to go to that festival." So he went to the first festival. And in the fall of 1985, Ted organized the Texas Storytellers Guild. Mostly some of his students, a handful of my students, some other people from around the Denton area. And the first meeting was in September, and at the October meeting, the second meeting, someone from the Associated Press had already heard about it and came to the meeting and began to publicize it. He made an appointment with Dr. Colson to have an interview with him, and then he wrote an article that was syndicated and distributed in newspapers not all over Texas, but really scattered around the country. I don't know who the Associated Press person was. I wish I did. I'd like to say thank you, because he gave us some of our really good publicity, and people began to call into Denton to ask questions and want to know, how do I get involved with this, and can anybody be a storyteller? The first storytelling festival happened because Finley said, we shouldn't have to just wait for people to go all the way to Jonesboro. We should have a festival in Texas. And so March the 1st of 1986, we had that first festival here in Denton. And Finley was so excited that before people were leaving that festival, He had already picked a date for a festival the following year, and we've been having festivals ever since. And this year we had our 25th one. I've been there for all of them, and that's been great. I've gone way out of my way to be here some of those times because I didn't want to have one year happen when I wasn't here. So I'm a veteran of all of them. Elizabeth Ellis was one of the tellers for the first one. She is now the president of this organization. One of the people on the list of people who attended that first one is Marianne Blue. And Marianne Blue was the artistic director of this particular festival and one other festival as well. But it's been a fun organization to watch grow and change and begin to work at bringing in some young people and some students who are even elementary age students. And to plan that in the future, this organization will be going on because other generations are coming along. I don't know what else you need from me.
That's some great history. And I didn't realize you've been to every.
I met Finley Stewart when he was about 18 and heard him perform for the first time then. And he and James Howard began to perform together for a while and were tellers in the public schools for most of a year. One semester after they quit telling in the schools, a girl named Delana Reed was the teller in the school the following year. She's, I think, still a faculty member of the Storytelling Master's Degree program at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, just out of Jonesboro. And I haven't seen her for a year or two, but I think she's still there and still teaching there. And she's been part of this group since she sat in Ted Colson's class and discovered that storytelling was part of the field of communication.
Wow. Are there any storytellers over the years that have made an impression on you?
Oh yes. And some of them continued to be outstanding people. Some of them got tired, lost their energy, or something. I don't know what. So some have come and gone. The first summer conference I went to, or we call them summer conferences now, national conferences, but we didn't call it that then. We called it a summer congress, and then they called it a summer institute, and it may have had more names than that. But the first year I went to a summer meeting in the Jonesboro area, we were having those summer events out at Washington College, a beautiful little Presbyterian school, old school. And we stayed on the campus. And one of the people I met there was a guy from Massachusetts named Jay O'Callahan. And Jay and I got acquainted because I told him I had once lived in Boston, and we discovered that I lived in the same neighborhood he grew up in, a neighborhood he calls Pill Hill, and so did other people because it was a medical district. But he is a very interesting storyteller and was one of the most creative people I nearly ever met. And he was a fantastic storyteller. He's also telling this year, I think, again at the National Storytelling Festival. In about 1982, after I'd been going up there for 3 or 4 years, I guess, a little notice appeared in the Yarn Spinner, I think, was what we were calling the newsletter from the national organization. At that time, I'm not sure it was still the Yarn Spinner then, but there was a little notice in some of their publication that said during the summer there's going to be a week-long workshop, and anybody who was interested in telling family stories might want to come to Jonesboro and do a workshop with a guy named Donald Davis. I had already met Donald and already known him and heard him tell and knew he was wonderful. He was pastoring a church in a Methodist church in Charlotte, North Carolina then, and flying a plane himself over to Jonesboro to tell. And that's the way he was getting around through the mountains to do some telling and get back in time to take care of his congregation. But how many people do you think would come to Jonesboro if you advertised now that Donald Davis was teaching a workshop on family narratives? Well, you couldn't. This auditorium might not hold them. 8 people came. We sat around a table with Donald in the old Slayman house there in Jonesboro that was our office building then. And it was delightful. He wasn't really telling family stories. He had one family story, and then he had some stories that he called his Uncle Frank stories, the outrageous, outlandish, kooky, funny stories that supposedly had been handed down in his family from an uncle. At any rate, it was a delightful week, and we all began to put together some stories. Jim May, I think, is one of the only people who's still involved in storytelling that I know who was there as one of those 8. But we just sat around the table and worked on stories, and one afternoon he said, let's take a 30-minute break, go outside and walk around, do whatever you need to do, and come back with a new story you've never told before. And the story I produced in 30 minutes was one I'd never really told anywhere and never even thought of telling. And when I finished it, he said, of course, you've been telling that story for years. And I said, I swear, Donald, I never told it before. But it's been part of my repertoire ever since. And sometimes people tell me that of the stories they remember, that one's one of the most memorable ones. It's a 30-minute wonder. So sometimes stories take years and years to put together, and sometimes it just takes a few minutes with the right chemistry. But Donald certainly is one of my favorites because of the kind of material he tells. I think really true storytellers use their own material. In the beginning, most everybody that I knew who was becoming a real storyteller was telling lots of fairy tales and legends. And while I told some of those, I'd been telling some of those to my students off and on for years, I wanted to tell stories that came from my family's history. And so for a while, people were saying, don't tell families, do you think anybody will want to hear them?